It's a great jumper. You look great in it.
Do I?
Yeah. Welcome back to the University of Sikistan. We're back with this year's first paper review. We haven't done one in a few weeks. Technically, that was last year.
Hey, first of the year.
There's some dad jokes for you.
This time, we're being
last year.
supported by fake paper, which you can write on it and rewrite on it again.
Yeah,
it's a game changer.
It's phenomenal. Today's paper review is called Muscle Activation Patterns During Variable Resistance Deadlift Training with and Without Elastic Bands. It's a little bit of a Lido. This is coming at us from University of Gloucester, United Kingdom. A couple of different authors. I feel like these might have been student authors. I'm not sure, but I feel like this was free to access, which was nice to see. Okay, long story short, we had team of investigators, team of researchers, team of sports scientists, maybe a team of goblins. We don't know what they were. They're just names in the paper. We've no idea. They were looking at muscular activation through EMG data, power and velocity of barbells resisted with bands. So basically a barbell with a band. They had set them up on a platform, dumbbells weighing down the bands. What we had was 15 different men. The men were significantly strong enough for this paper that I was happy enough for their strength. Just a general
You did mention that, to be fair.
That they're strong enough. You know, that these weren't strong enough people, whereas like anyone any more trained wouldn't be any more useful for this study. So their average deadlift was 190 plus or minus 28. So that's pretty reasonable given their body weights and their heights. They are sufficiently strong people with deadlifts that these have a meaningful effect across, kind of reasonably straight men.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm happy with that. There's 15 of them. What we had was an EMG taking basically the vast majority of the muscular activation in the muscles in the lower body of our subjects, nothing in the upper body, which we'll get to later, which would have been interesting. We had bar velocity and then power production, which Fitz will get to, which was not necessarily correct. We had 4 conditions. We had a 100 kilo barbell with no load on it. Then we had an 80 kilo barbell with a 20 kilo band calculated for it at the top. We had a 75 kilo barbell plus 25 kilos of band. And then we had a 70 kilo barbell plus 30 kilos of band. 30 kilos of band added to it. Calculations are good. Their setup look good. How they determine the band and all that stuff looks pretty consistent and reasonable. Fitz, you want to get to the results? What did they get?
Sure, we may as well get the results. The results are in 3 sections. EMG data. Then we have power, then we have velocity. Which could really be in one section because power doesn't really exist in this paper. But EMG data, what you're looking at in EMG data, as some of you may know, is the electrical activity that's going on in that muscle group right now. So if we put EMG little receptors on Garth's bicep, his biceps relaxed, there'd be a small amount of background EMG all the time. Then if he was to do a curl, that would show some electrical activity within the muscle. There's contractions going on, and it's really good in studies like this to track like which muscle groups are being activated. If we change something about an exercise, do we get different kind of activation patterns across the subjects? So first thing we're looking at in the EMG data is seeing, did the deadlift condition, so whether you had a band on, what percentage of mass was brought about by the band, did that have effect on mean maximum voluntary isometric contraction percentage? So what does that mean as a number? Maximum voluntary isometric contraction percentage basically means you strap somebody into a chair. So if you were doing this for the hamstring, you'll strap them into a chair, put them in a position where there's a load cell or something blocking their heel. You'll hook them up to an EMG. You'll get them to contract as hard as possible, probably shouting at them, giving them some strong verbal encouragement. That you will get a number there for your EMG output for maximum voluntary isometric contraction. You will then get them to perform an exercise with those data collecting devices still on them, and you'll get a percentage of the electrical activity, and that will show maybe 90% of their total maximum voluntary isometric contraction percentage is being used currently. We saw no significant data on deadlift condition on mean MCIV percentage. There was on peak MVIC percentage for the medial gastrocnemius and the semitendinosus, but not for the glutamus maximus VL, which is vastus lateralis, and VMO, which is vastus medialis. We saw peak MVIC percentage for MG, which is the medial gastrocnemius, decrease significantly. So you're actually getting a decrease in EMG data when you go from no band to band 25%, no band to band 30%, and band 20% to band 25%. So the medial gastrocnemius is actually turning off as you're adding more band tension. We see the same kind of thing happening here with the semitendinosus, where basically that hamstring is being activated less the more and more band tension you put on the bar. We're going to talk about later about why that might be happening, or why bands might cause that to happen a small bit more, but that's a very important thing to note. The next thing to note is there is no significant effect of deadlift condition on rate of activation. So a very, very common thing we'll hear is that the banded work will allow people to kind of move faster, become more powerful, work on their speed of the bar, or bar speed. This will show basically that we're not getting a different kind of rate of activation being faster or slower or whatever. So that's an important thing to note for a small bit later on. Okay, on to our second and third groups then, power and velocity. The reason I say power and velocity could be put into the same thing is because they're being calculated in using the same piece of equipment. Power had a significant effect for concentric peak power and concentric mean power. So when we look at the data, when we're using bands, that power number, whatever number you want to put on it, the peak is higher and the mean is higher. Now, that's not what you might think immediately. The next thing we have is concentric peak power. So no band significantly increased when we went to band 20%. No band significantly increased when we went to band 25%, 30%, and then band 20% significantly increased when we went to band 30%. So we're seeing increases in power when that percentage of load is higher with the band. So basically, less actual weight, more band weight, we appear to have higher power numbers. There's no significant difference between the CPP at band 20 and band 25 and band 25 and band 30. So that just is something that in a kind of programming context, you're probably not going to have a massive difference between those smaller kind of 5% increments in how much you load your bands, which if you're somebody who's looking to train with bands and you're wondering if you have to buy all the different kind of bands, is a very positive note. There's probably not much of a difference between them. Velocity, significant effect on peak velocity and mean velocity when you're using the bands, and then it's the same kind of data again. You get higher velocity numbers when there's less weight on the bar and more band weight on the bar.
Okay, so you done?
Yeah.
On to our discussion. So there's a couple of different things around this, and it's coming out from two different contexts. So we have people who are trying to use bands to increase their maximum deadlift, and then we have people who are athletes looking to increase their power and velocity and doing that work in the gym. So if we look at this first from the example, maybe the positive side of things. So if you're an athlete in season and you're trying to train power and velocity movements, it makes sense for you to use less weight, the least amount of weight in the gym possible, to get the most productive power and velocity training done, because you want to save yourself. You don't want to be trying to progress your force production, so that would be using heavier weights. You want to be doing things that will maintain or potentially slightly increase, or at least at minimum, hold off the decay of your power and strength over the course of the season. And so using bands seems to be consistently in the literature. It's kind of tentative at the moment, but over the last few years, accommodating resistance seems to be quite productive in increasing increasing power and velocity in the gym. So doing stuff like deadlifts, maybe band resistance squats, stuff like that seems to be quite useful in increasing the power and velocity in certain movements. So if you're an in-season athlete, maybe athletics, maybe field sports, and you want to do a little bit of power and velocity training and a little bit of gym stuff, it would seem, using some form of accommodating resistance, then this does seem to be, along with the other evidence, pointing in the positive direction for that. However, if we go to the other side, if we look at people, probably a lot of people watching this who've been wondering, do I need bands to use and increase, do I need to use bands to increase my maximum deadlift? The answer is no. basically no. There's no good evidence in this form to show that you should be using bands, that they'll be productive for you. Going by this paper, for example, should you use bands to increase your maximum deadlift? Your maximum deadlift is related to how much force you can produce. They can quite accurately predict what a weight is as a percentage of your max by how fast the barbell is moving without knowing what your actual maximum lift is. So you need to be able to produce more force, not be able to move faster barbells. You need to produce more force to increase your maximum deadlift. So using bands in this example doesn't help you produce more force. Rather, if anything, it's probably altering the technical pattern of your deadlift towards the negative if it's deactivating certain muscles, specifically in this case your hamstring muscles. Other studies have found using deadlifts with chains deactivated the glutes. So a separate investigation, a separate study with different forms of accommodating resistance deactivate different muscles. Basically what that's showing us is it's negatively altering the pattern of our sport specific movement. Like we always talk about, you shouldn't use things like loaded bats, you shouldn't do things like weighted punches. In the same way, you shouldn't be trying to massively alter your sport specific movement in powerlifting. Now, there is little nuances with this, like for example, pause deadlifts would be okay, high bar back squats are productive, pause deadlifts are very productive, stuff like that. But when we get to things like where it's really changing the muscular activation like this with bands and chains, more often than not, it's either net neutral, it's probably not going to do much to you, or it's probably changing to the negative, especially if you're not a long-term lifter with a lot of years experience with your technique and it's not well defined. You may be negatively altering the activated muscles in your lift and significantly deteriorating your technique to the negative and not towards the positive.
The next thing I think we should discuss is that kind of pair of muscles that appears to be less active, or that appears to be kind of turning off as we start doing banded pieces. So it's semitendinosus and the medial gastrocnemius. Medial gastrocnemius, if you look at the back of your calf, and you've like the long flat muscle that runs up from the bottom, and then you've the two kind of balls at the top. The inner ball of muscle there is your medial gastrocnemius, right? It's involved obviously in extension of the ankle. It's also interplaying with the knee quite heavily. Then when we look at semitendinosus, that's the kind of middle of your three hamstrings. So it's the longest of your hamstrings. It's connecting on up in your pelvis and down on the medial, so like the inside of your knee. Why might these be turning off? Why might they be less active when there's less weight being pulled off the floor? And it's mainly looking at the start position of the deadlift and what you're doing at the very beginning of the deadlift. So when we're down setting up for the barbell, usually we're looking at a few things. We're looking at the hip height and where the knees are in relation to the hips. So then as we start to pull the barbell off the floor, trying to keep the knees forward and the quads engaged, we're trying to make sure those hips don't shoot up too quickly and we don't suddenly start to engage the hips a small bit more and push the barbell away from us. For that reason, when we look at the banded versions versus the non-banded version, you have to look at the actual load that's there when these two muscles are being used. So in the first pull of the deadlift, as we bring the barbell from the floor up to around knee height, these muscles aren't being used as much because there's not the same load on the bar. If it's B20, that particular group, there's 80 kilos on the bar and there's 80 kilos of load per se on the bar at that point, because the band isn't really stretched. The band might still be actually loose at this point, and these muscle groups just aren't coming into play. So when Gerf talks about those muscle patterns being altered, you changing your sport specific piece, you're changing the movement entirely. And if it is something where you're trying to get stronger and you're trying to use banded work or chained work to get a better deadlift or a better squat or a better bench, it really isn't it. Now, if you're using that squat, bench or deadlift to get better at playing football or get better at sprinting, then they might be options, but they really aren't the option to use if you're trying to get better at the actual lifts themselves. The second point, and this is by far the most egregious error in this paper, is the calculation of power isn't correct. So power, as everyone who watches the channel regularly will have heard us spout on about constantly, power is the rate at which work is done, right? So you're looking at the amount of work you're doing. You're moving 100 kilos, probably a meter or a bit over a meter. That's the amount of work you're doing. The rate at which you're doing it, you're looking at the speed that you're pulling that off the ground, how long it's taking you to do it. When we look at power being calculated with say 100 kilos again, or we look at power being calculated as that B20, so that's 80 kilos plus 20 kilos of bands, the amount of work you're doing is not the same. So as we spoke earlier, when we're pulling it off the floor, it might weigh 80 kilos, then as we come past the knee, it might be 85, then it becomes 90 kilos, then it becomes 95, then it becomes 100. That's not the same thing as lifting 100 kilos from the floor all the way up. So that basically makes all of our power numbers null and void. It might appear as though, when I talked earlier about concentric peak power being significantly higher in our B20 than it is in no band group, our B25 than it is in no band group, our B30 than it is in no band group. These values pretty much don't mean anything because you're comparing two things that are incomparable. The weight isn't the same, the amount of work you're doing isn't the same. Now, would it be different if we had 80 kilos on the bar and then we had 80 kilos on the bar plus chains? Would that be more relatable? Could you compare those two numbers and come up with something more valuable? Probably not. If it's incomparable in the first case, it's incomparable in the second case. And it kind of leaves us at this junction or this roadblock where, can we really look at power outputs in these kinds of studies where we have facilitative loading versus standard loading? To be honest, I don't think we can.
So that probably is one of the main issues with this study in particular. The kind of leg they could fall back on is it is in conjunction with the rest of the literature in the last few years, as you mentioned, that accommodating resistance does seem to produce more power and velocity. But in a practical sense, we know that 100 kilos total with band tension isn't the same as 100 kilos. What would have been interesting in this study is if they've done the same group of men, but with the same lifts, whereas, for example, they did the same, like 70, 75 and 80 kilos. If they just lifted those barbells without the use of bands, what kind of power and velocity would have seen? If they're like, look, lift this as fast as possible, would we have seen similar power and velocity numbers? And it's, you don't know what you don't know until you got that. You would assume a certain trend towards those. You'd assume they would have been very fast. But is it something similar, for example, with weightlifting technique? We know, for example, when you lifts in excess of 90%, there's a different form of technique. There's different muscular activations that can't really be replicated at lighter weights. These are things that cannot be voluntarily activated. These are things that are activated only when there's sufficient mass or resistance against us. So would it have happened that if the subjects had done these 80 kilo deadlifts as fast as possible, would it have been impossible for them to activate, that kind of same power production that they would have gotten with the resistance on the way up? It's hard to know. You don't know until you kind of get that answer. It's the same with in the office where they're filling the phone with the coins. So, for example, it's very hard for people to voluntarily activate that much, and it's kind of a protective mechanism for your muscles. Otherwise, you'd be picking up pens and stuff as fast as you could and potentially tearing biceps and applying maximum force. It's kind of a protective mechanism of your CNS. So it's quite interesting. But again, they seem to be matching up with the consensus of the rest of the literature. We'll try to do some more of these maybe in a few months again when we come back around to it. It is interesting. I think it kind of confirms a little bit, maybe for example even the muscular activation side of things, mostly for people trying to get better at deadlifting. It's probably not the way. Theoretically it doesn't seem to be the way. You're not looking to produce more power, and if it's deactivating muscles, is that really going to help your lockout? The answer is it's unlikely so. Now we know this is not looking for a bigger deadlifts, but if we're inferring data from this for you guys, I would think maybe that's not the way.
Do let us know in the comments below. I know there's going to be a lot of people commenting on this, that they use bands and that bands really help them with X, Y and Z. Do let us know below. We'd be particularly interested if you used bands and use a different deadlift program maybe a year or two before, a year or two after, and you're kind of comparing and contrasting those two approaches. It would be very interesting to see.
If you're wondering about the other lifts, there's potentially different results. There's been conflicting results, for example, in the squat. Some have found actually increased muscular activation due to the nature of the eccentric is loaded differently, obviously, compared to the deadlift. So in another study then, however, it found it's zero different muscular activation. So it's a little bit conflicting in terms of the use of bands and chains in terms of muscular activation for the other lifts. So I wouldn't immediately jump to apply to those, but I think the answer is likely to be the same, especially in the context of drastically altering your sport-specific movements in ways that are beyond your control voluntarily. Thanks, lads.